back with Northwestern Outdoors Radio. I'm John Cruz. Now is the time to get ready for hunting season, and the way you're going to do it is with spotting scopes, with binoculars, and especially your rifle scope. We've got a guy on board who knows all about these things. His name is John Barsness. He's written a book called Modern Hunting Optics. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
John, tell our listeners about your book, which I am reading and beginning to think of as a go-to fantastic reference guide for anyone wanting to buy a spotting scope, binoculars, or especially a rifle scope.
Well, thank you, but it's actually my second optics book. I did publish one 15 years ago, but so much has changed in hunting optics and since then that I had to do a second one, and this pretty much catches everything up as far as we've gotten. It looks at optics as a team of optics instead of just your binocular is the most important or the scope is most important, and how to select optics that complement each other in the field.
I like that. I love the premise of that, and I love the book as well. And I'm guessing, living out in Montana, Townsend, Montana, you got a lot of wide open spaces to go ahead and work with a lot of optics out there, don't you?
We can see for miles and miles and miles.
Well, that's a good problem to have in the line of work you're at. So let's talk about rifle scopes. Is there some basic testing you can do? Let's say I'm shopping at the local sportsman's warehouse, and I'm trying to figure out what brand or what scope to buy. You know, if I'm comparing apples to apples, what are some things I should look at, when I'm looking at buying a scope?
Well, it's difficult to make a lot of tests inside a store. You can test the optics by looking into a darker corner of the store.
Okay.
Most people turn around and try to look out a window.
True.
That doesn't work very well because it's all bright light. But other than that, you need to do some research before you go into the store about mechanics, because you can't test how the adjustments work and how well the scope's going to hold up. The Internet's a great place to get ratings from different websites on how things are holding up, or reviews especially from mail-order sites where customers can rate the products they've tried. Because optics are not the most important part of a scope. They're one of the important parts, but your scope is useless if it doesn't stay pointed in the same direction that it's supposed to all the time. So
when you're talking about that, you're talking more about the mounting brackets and such.
Well, you're talking about the scope rings that hold it to the rifle. That's a factor, but a scope is the most delicate part of a hunting rifle.
Oh, yes.
A modern hunting rifle, and the adjustments are probably the most important part. They can be erratic, and they can also go screwy. And the less you pay for a scope, the more likely those inner parts are not going to hold up over the long run or work right in the first place.
Well, there you go. You get what you pay for, and again, look at those reviews. Let's talk about magnification. What do you recommend for different species, or should I perhaps say for different types of terrain and hunting?
That's another part of mechanics of scopes. Most people really like variables these days. They're by far the most popular scopes. Unfortunately, the harder a rifle kicks, the more likely a variable is to fall apart unless you spend considerable money, and even then they can fall apart because the way they're built is they have extra parts in there to change the magnification. And those parts are small because they have to fit inside the scope, and they can be fairly delicate. A lot of people like the versatility of a variable scope, like a 3 to 9, 3.5 to 10. For a deer rifle, it's going to be used everywhere from close-up to moderately long range. Mm-hmm. But some people these days are going with fixed power scopes, usually about a 6 power, sometimes a 4 or less, because they found them to be more reliable, especially in lightweight scopes.
That actually makes a lot of sense to me. I own a lot of fishing rods, and I'm guessing you own a lot of scopes. But let's talk about the guy who has, just one gun, a 30-06 or a 270, the one-gun man who uses his rifle for deer, for bear, for pronghorn, for elk. What kind of scope would you suggest he invest in for his one rifle?
I would go with the typical 3.5 to 10 variable or a fixed 6 power. Well, depending on the terrain. If you're hunting more in timber, I'd go with a 4 instead of a 6. But a 6 is surprisingly versatile. So I shot a running wild boar once at 10 yards.
Oh, wow.
Power scope. Yeah. And I've shot at the other end. I've shot the animals out to 500 yards with one. So it's more versatile than most people believe.
What are some really good, reliable brands out there when it comes to scope makers that you're probably not going to go wrong with?
A lot of Americans buy loopholes, partly because of their guarantee. They will fix or replace any scope, no matter who it belongs to, for the life of the scope.
Nice.
That helps.
Yes.
A lot of people these days are, if they want a bigger variable scope, they're going with Night Force. which is a much more rugged scope. They're more expensive than a lot of scopes too, but they're very tough. They're essentially developed for the tactical market.
Okay.
But a lot of hunters use them too, and they're very, very good, especially for a variable. I would recommend them. But there's a bunch of good scopes out there. I probably have 20 different brands, and it helps to ask around.
Absolutely. And again, it sounds like we're about on par in the fishing rod versus scope category, so that's nice to know. Folks, you're listening to Northwestern Outdoors Radio. We're talking to John Barsness. He's the author of a great book called Modern Hunting Optics. He hails from Townsend, Montana. And I really want to get into this next subject, because I was reading your book, and I found out, as I read this book, that I have subscribed to a common myth for a long time, the 25-yard sight-in myth. Tell our listeners what that is and why it's wrong.
Well, actually, at one time, it wasn't a myth. It started in the 1930s with Weaver Scope Company. And back then, scopes were slimmer and they were mounted lower, partly because scopes weren't as reliable, so they wanted to make them approximately the same height as the iron sights on a rifle so that you could use either one. If the scope fogged or whatever, you could take it off and use the iron sights. So they wanted them mounted low so the same stock shape would work with the scopes as the iron sights. And a low-mounted scope, 25-yard sight-in works pretty well. You sight it in at 25 yards, and depending on the cartridge, a big game cartridge will be on again at like 200 to 250. It's a pretty slick system. But these days, our scopes are much bigger, more powerful. They're mounted higher. And the higher you mount a scope, the higher the bullet impacts downrange, because it's two angles intersecting where you're sighted in. And if you have a scope mounted twice as high as one was down in the 1930s, you could sight in at 25 yards, and out at 200, you could be 5 inches high.
Oh, boy.
And it's easy to miss a deer at 200 with a 5-inch high point of impact, believe me.
Well, that's really interesting. So it's not the fact that it was a myth to start with. It's the way that guns are made now and scopes are mounted now that has basically made the good teaching obsolete at this point.
Yeah, it's still a handy way to start getting sighted in. It's a good way to get on paper at 100 yards. Sight in at 25 because you have very little chance of missing the target at 25 yards, even if the scope's way off. And then go out to 100 yards and refine your sight in.
All right. Folks, there's a whole bunch more in Modern Hunting Optics that we didn't get to cover. But folks, you're just going to have to buy the book. So let's go ahead and tell our listeners where they can find it, and let's give out a website too.
They can order it on the internet for $25, which includes shipping, from the website riflesandrecipes.com, which is the website that my wife, Eileen Clark, and I run.
All right, so that's riflesandrecipes.com. Eileen Clark, she's a great author in her own right, has a book called Slice of the Wild, and John Barsness has got this fantastic book called Modern Hunting Optics. That's going to be your reference guide for all things optically related when it comes to hunting out there. The website, again, is riflesandrecipes.com. John, thanks for taking the time to give us some advice here on Northwestern Outdoors Radio.
Great, thank you.